Something unexpected just happened inside the Montreal Canadiens organization, and the more I looked into it, the more convinced I became that this is a much bigger move than it might appear on the surface. The Canadiens have officially brought Derek Lalonde onto Martin St. Louis's coaching staff, and while some fans initially saw it as a routine offseason addition, people around the league are reading this very differently. But from what I'm hearing, this wasn't simply about filling an open position. This was about adding a coach with experience in places where Montreal believes it still has work to do. My take is that the Canadiens aren't just adding another assistant. They're investing in someone they believe can accelerate the next stage of this rebuild. The timing of this move also tells an interesting story. Trevor Letowski stepped away from his role behind the Canadiens bench to spend more time with his family, creating a vacancy on Martin St. Louis's staff. By all accounts, the organization handled that transition with respect, and there's still hope Letowski can remain involved with the Canadiens in another capacity. But once that opening appeared, Montreal had a decision to make. They could have promoted someone internally, looked toward the college ranks, or taken a chance on a younger coach looking for an NHL opportunity. Instead, they went after Derek Lalonde. That immediately caught my attention because Lalonde isn't someone who needs an introduction around the NHL. This is a coach who's experienced just about every level of pressure the league can throw at you. He's coached rebuilding teams. He's coached Stanley Cup contenders. He's won championships as an assistant. He's managed expectations as a head coach. Whether you agree with every stop in his career or not, you can't argue that he hasn't seen virtually every situation an NHL bench can present. Here's how I read the situation. The Canadiens already believe they have the right head coach in Martin St. Louis. They've been patient with his development, just as they've been patient with the development of their young core. But even successful young coaches benefit from having experienced voices beside them. League sources have consistently described Lalonde as someone with a structured approach, someone who pays close attention to defensive details, penalty killing, and preparation. Those are exactly the kinds of qualities that can complement St. Louis's player-focused coaching style. When I first heard Lalonde's name connected to Montreal, my initial reaction was that this made more sense than many people would probably realize. Fans often remember coaches for how their last head coaching job ended, but that's rarely the whole story. Lalonde's time with the Detroit Red Wings produced mixed results, and there's no point pretending otherwise. Expectations were high, and Detroit ultimately decided to move in a different direction. That's the reality of coaching in today's NHL. But coaching isn't always a simple success or failure equation. Sometimes a coach who struggles as a head coach can become one of the league's most valuable assistants. We've seen that happen countless times across professional hockey. Different roles demand different strengths. Running an entire organization from behind the bench isn't the same as focusing on systems, defensive structure, special teams, or individual player development. That's one reason I don't think Montreal hired Lalonde because of what happened in Detroit. I think they hired him because of everything he accomplished before Detroit and because of what he can still offer going forward. Before becoming the Red Wings head coach, Lalonde built an outstanding reputation with the Tampa Bay Lightning under John Cooper. Those weren't ordinary seasons. Tampa was one of the NHL's model organizations, winning back-to-back Stanley Cups and consistently playing deep into the playoffs. Coaches throughout the league have spoken about the preparation that went into those teams, the attention to detail, and the defensive commitment required to sustain that level of success. Nobody wins championships alone, and Lalonde wasn't the face of those Lightning teams, but he was part of a coaching staff that established one of the strongest cultures in modern hockey. That experience matters. It especially matters for a Canadiens team that's trying to transition from rebuilding into legitimate playoff contention. Here's what I'm hearing from people around the league. Montreal believes its young roster has reached the point where talent alone isn't enough. The organization has spent years collecting prospects, developing young players, and adding pieces through the draft and trades. Now comes the difficult part, turning potential into consistent winning hockey. That's where experienced coaches become valuable. One area that immediately comes to mind is defensive play. Over the last several seasons, Montreal has shown flashes of becoming a dangerous offensive team. The skill is there, the speed is there, but consistency in its own zone has often been the difference between winning and losing. Defensive coverage, communication, and special teams have all been areas where improvement could translate directly into more points in the standings. Lalonde has built much of his reputation around structure. I'm not suggesting he'll suddenly transform Montreal into the league's best defensive team overnight. Hockey simply doesn't work that way. But adding someone with his background gives Martin St. Louis another experienced voice capable of identifying adjustments throughout a long NHL season. And that's another point I think deserves more attention. This isn't about replacing Martin St. Louis or changing the Canadiens' identity. If anything, it feels like management is doubling down on their current direction. General Manager Kent Hughes and Executive Vice President Jeff Gorton have repeatedly emphasized patience during this rebuild. They haven't chased quick fixes. They haven't sacrificed the future for short-term headlines. Instead, they focused on building something sustainable. Hiring Lalonde fits that philosophy almost perfectly. Rather than making a flashy move designed to dominate headlines for a week, they quietly strengthened one of the areas that often separates good organizations from great ones, the coaching staff itself. I'm also watching how this move could affect the Canadiens' younger players. Montreal has one of the youngest groups in the NHL, and while raw talent creates excitement, young players often benefit the most from coaches who can simplify difficult situations. That's something Lalonde has experience doing during Detroit's rebuilding years. He worked with developing players every day, helping prospects adjust to the speed and demands of the NHL. Not every prospect reached star status, but that experience shouldn't be overlooked when evaluating what he could bring to Montreal's bench. Then there's another angle that I think has quietly become part of this story. Lalonde most recently spent time with the Toronto Maple Leafs before those coaching staff changes. Whenever someone moves from one Original Six organization to another, fans naturally pay attention. It adds another layer of intrigue, even if the circumstances are completely professional. I'm told there wasn't any dramatic controversy surrounding his departure. Coaching staffs evolve all the time. New voices come in, others move on. That's part of the business. Still, Montreal had options this offseason. The Canadiens didn't have to hire Derek Lalonde. They chose to. Organizations don't make coaching hires in a vacuum. Every decision sends a message, whether it's to the players, the coaching staff, or the rest of the league. In this case, my take is that the Canadiens are signaling they're ready to raise expectations, not championship expectations overnight, but expectations that this young group should start taking meaningful steps forward. When you look at Montreal's roster, it's easy to understand why the front office believes now is the right time to strengthen the coaching staff. This isn't the same Canadiens team that was simply collecting draft picks and hoping for better days. The organization has assembled one of the NHL's most promising young cores, and with that comes a different kind of pressure. Young players eventually stop being prospects. They become the players expected to win hockey games. That's where experienced coaching becomes even more valuable. Here's what I'm hearing from people around the league. One of Lalonde's biggest strengths has always been preparation. Players who've worked under him have often talked about structure, communication, and attention to detail. Those qualities don't always generate headlines, but they're often the difference between a team that competes for a playoff spot and one that consistently falls short. Think about the teams that make deep playoff runs every spring. They don't just rely on talent, they rely on systems, they rely on discipline. They know where everyone is supposed to be on the ice, especially when the pressure rises. That's an area where Montreal still has room to grow. I also think this hire gives Martin St. Louis something every successful head coach eventually needs, another experienced perspective. St. Louis deserves a great deal of credit for connecting with his players. His communication style has been praised since he arrived behind the Canadiens bench, and many of Montreal's younger players have clearly responded to his approach. But coaching in the NHL isn't a one-person job. Every successful bench has assistants who challenge ideas, offer different viewpoints, and help solve problems during the grind of an 82-game season. That's why I don't see Lalonde as someone coming in to change everything. I see him as someone coming in to strengthen what already exists. Another interesting aspect of this story is how quickly Montreal moved once the opportunity presented itself. There didn't appear to be a long public search or weeks of uncertainty. Once Trevor Letowski stepped away from his bench duties, the Canadiens identified someone with NHL experience and acted. That tells me this wasn't a rushed decision. It was likely a calculated one. League sources indicate Montreal had a clear profile in mind for the role, someone who understood NHL systems, someone who had worked with veteran players and developing prospects, someone who had experienced both success and adversity behind the bench. Lalonde checks every one of those boxes. Of course, not everyone is convinced this is automatically a home run hire. I've seen plenty of fans point to his record as Detroit's head coach and ask whether that should be a concern. It's a fair question, and I understand where that skepticism comes from. Results matter in professional sports.